Hi, SusanClaire here, GourmetQuilter.com. I just wanted to get started on Welcome to My World. So, welcome to my world. It's a happy place. This is the block of the month and this is part 1. So we're going to get started. This is our first block here, the boat ride. And so you've most likely got your pattern already, and we've got a picture of the whole quilt at the beginning of the pattern. We've also got some material requirements. If you haven't got your fabrics yet, chances are that you've already got them. That tells you all the fabrics that I've used for all the backgrounds. This tells you for the larger applique. Some things that are larger appliques like the grey pathway, the mountain, the snow, some of the sand down in the water, things like that that were too large to fit on the pre-cuts. I've suggested pre-cuts for most of the applique, 10-inch squares, 2.5-inch strips, 5-inch squares, because I found that gave me a good variety of colours and things like that. So that's all of that part of the pattern. And then we've got some general information that tells you how I've gone about doing the applique. So tracing your shapes, ironing to the back of your fabric, cutting everything out, and that sort of thing there. And so then we get to part 1. How exciting is that? So part 1 is the boat ride. And so you'll notice here that on your pattern that this is actually a diagram, not a photograph. And I've done it as a diagram for a couple of reasons. It was a little bit easier when I was getting things organised, but as much as that, a diagram shows you, because I can put outlines on things, where things are sitting in front and behind much better than perhaps a photograph might. So keep an eye on things like that, because some things do sit behind, like these upright posts supporting the boat are in front of the boat, and the boat is in front of the girl and the boy because they're standing inside the boat and things like that. So there's a little bit of perspective thinking. So keep an eye on those sort of things. And then you've got some shapes ready for tracing, if you need to trace all your shapes onto your fusible web. But I did want to just go through with you some of the notes that I've written here. So for cutting the background piece for this block, this particular fabric does 2 different blocks. So it does our boat ride, and it does the roundabout up here as well. So we needed to be able to make sure we got both pieces out of the width of the fabric rather than having to buy a whole lot of extra yardage. So the pattern here does give you an amount to cut a full width strip of fabric that you can then cut this piece out of, and then from what was left of that piece you can turn this one side on and get that piece out as well. And you can turn these fabrics sideways because they're batiks and they're an all over colour, not a pattern or anything. So rather than wasting the fabric. So I've already cut my part 3 background out, but I can just set that aside now because I don't need it just yet. And then I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the applique positioning to get started. So what I've suggested here is that there's some measurements here to get you going. So this top little circle here, which is this little piece on the block over here, and then this base here. By positioning those 2, everything else will pretty much fit in as you go. So I've given you some measurements to measure in from the edge of your cut background to the side there where you can pop your little circle thing, and then the measurement that comes down so that you can have it sitting at the top there. There is a little bit of a gap there which you perhaps can't see on here, and that's because this pathway sits over the join, so we've got to allow for that as well. And so what I've done is positioned, I measured and I marked. I just use a pencil or some pins to mark my the sizings that I've suggested. And I've done the same thing on this bottom edge. I've come up and I've come in from that edge there as is shown on the pattern. And we want to position our pieces, but we don't want to iron them fully in place just yet because we've got to tuck a few things in behind. So what I've done here is I've positioned this and this center circle, but I haven't ironed it all in place, but I have ironed part of it. I've ironed this top bit because that's not going to move now, but this one I want to be able to tuck some of these upright pieces underneath and things like that. And the same thing with this bottom piece here. I positioned that one with the measurement from the edge and up from the lower edge, but I have ironed it, but just the lower half of the shape. This part is still open because this piece here wants to tuck in. These pieces are going to be sitting behind these circles and they also tuck in and things like that. So just keep an eye on those sorts of things as you go, and that's where this diagram will be quite helpful to you because you can see the outlines more clearly. I'll also mention that with the boat, the shape is in two pieces on the pattern, and that's partly because it wouldn't fit the paper, but also because I'm using the 10-inch squares for some of my shapes like this. It didn't fit the 10-inch square, so I've just cut it in two sections, and it's really not going to be a problem because that join is going to sit underneath that upright there, so you won't even see that it's joined. And then some of these pieces will sit on top, but of course the people need to sit in behind because they would be inside the boat. So just have a good look at the diagram, have a good look at your shapes, and I'll go ahead and I'll get all mine ironed on, and then I'll come back and show you and just go through a couple of those little points again, and then I can show you how to start doing some of the stitching. Hi, so I've been ironing all my shapes on. Everything's in place now. Now these couple of pieces here were a touch long. I did actually trim off a couple of little bits to make them the right length to fit behind. This comes across the front of the boat. That's the join underneath. We've got him standing inside the boat. She's inside the boat, and these little heads are just popping out over the top, and our clouds. Everything's looking great, and we're ready to start stitching. So I'll just mention a little bit about the thread, and then I'll show you some of the stitching. I've really just used two colours throughout the quilt. I've used a grey for pretty much all the applique. So sort of a medium-ish darkish. It's not super dark. And then for all the flesh colour, because I've used that same sort of colour fabric throughout, because it has quite a nice little bit of variation in it, because all our skin tones are a little bit different. And I've just used a cream. This one's a tad light perhaps, but it seems to cope all right. It's what I've used when I've done this quilt here. So all around anything that's faces and arms, or when there's legs and things like that, I've used the cream for the stitching, and everything else I've used the grey. So I've even used the grey where I've done the clouds and things like that. There's some little decorative swirls on these circles. I've probably just marked them with a pencil, and then I'll stitch them to do that. So I'll show you a little bit of that and how I've done all that as well. Hi. So I thought I'd just show you a little bit of the stitching. I've done a fair bit of it, but I've left some of these little swirls to show you how I've done that. So I'm free motion sewing. So I've dropped my feed teeth. I've got a little free motion foot on. Other than that, everything is just the same, and I'm all set to go. So when I start, I usually do a couple of stitches on top of each other, and that forms a lock, and then I can just start stitching. So I'm just moving the fabric, just taking my time, because we're thinking quite hard doing it this way. And going around. Now to do the little swirls, I have pencil marked them in just lightly. So I'm just going to come all the way in on that swirl, and then come all the way back out over the same stitching on the inside there. And then when I get back to this edge of this circle, I'm going to come along that same edge bit, and then I can just skip straight on to the next circle, come all the way around, and then I can come back to where I want to go in to do that swirl. So you can do a little bit of, I guess, over stitching over areas so that you don't have to keep completely stopping and starting. So I can come along this edge here, let's get that thread out the way, and then I can skip straight onto that next circle at that point. Doesn't really matter which way you go around. So I just thought I'd show you, and that's how I've done all the free motion, just stitching close to the edge, and then just occasionally when I've needed to go somewhere that's close by, I just run along the same stitching. But these little swirls, just to emphasize them, I go over those inner swirly bits twice. So I'll just keep going and finish that, and then I'll show you one of the little girl's hair. So I've finished doing all my little swirls here, and I've just got this little girl's hair to do here. So I thought I'd show you that. So I'm just going to start right where one of the little pigtails comes out. And I'm going to go, just as I said, just taking your time, free motion, around to here, and then I'm going to come out and outline the little pigtails. And then I can come around her face edge there. So I've done all the flesh, faces, arms and legs and things with that light coloured thread, and I'm doing everything else with this grey. So I like to go through and do all the faces, arms and legs first, and then I can change the colour, and then I don't have to keep changing colours again. Now I will just mention here, I've got this little bit of this blue post, just that, oops, there's a thread in the way there. Just that little bit that I hadn't done. I thought, well, I'll do that while I'm doing this bit of hair. And I can just skip along the very edge of that bit there and then come back up, and then I'm ready to come back onto her hair here, so that we're not having to stop and start for every tiny little bit. And then I'll just do a couple of lock stitches to end off again, and then we're all done. And so I think we're doing pretty well here. So I've done all the stitching now. So I've got the clouds done, and I've done some of the little faces with the pens, but I've left these little faces here, so we'll do those now. I've done the extra little people watching and waving down there. So I've got the Pigma pens that I like to use. I've got a black, I like to use the really fine ones. This is says it's an 05. You wouldn't want to go any larger than that. It could be even smaller. And I've got a red, and that's an 01, so really fine. So I like to, you could mark the pattern shapes here have got their little faces on if you want to mark them on the fabric, or I like to just perhaps come through and do it. I have done a few by now. So the thing to remember when you do eyes, even though they're only little sort of imaginary type people, very simple in shape, our eyes are actually halfway down our head. So on this little guy's head here, not including his hat, because that would sit a little bit above, but from chin to top of head, the eyes are approximately halfway down. Same thing on this little girl, approximately halfway down. In actual fact, our eyes are halfway down our head. We just don't think they are because of the way our hair sits. So I'm just going to come through and do the eyes. Hopefully you can see this. I need to be able to look at them pretty much face on. So remember, roughly halfway from top to bottom. And I like the finer pen. I would rather build up a slightly bigger circle than having a great big blob to start with. So I come through and do the little eyes. And her eyes. And I like to keep the faces simple. You may have a preferred way of doing faces, but I find this works really well for me. And then just some little smiles here, just with the little red pen, just a little. It doesn't take very much, and yet it makes all the difference to how they look. And that's pretty much all I do. And that's that block all finished. So now I can just trim my stabilizer so that it's the same size of the block, and it's done, ready for the next block. So that was part 1, or block 1 of Welcome to My World. Thank you, and I will see you with part 2.